All right, good morning. We're live from San Francisco at the Mind the Bridge Innovation Center. We are actually glad to be here in flesh and bone with a bunch of friends. Today's topic is trade organization and government organizations, a launch of a report that is available from now, and a few insights on how companies, entities that are dealing with the innovation from governments, representing governments in California, so not just Silicon Valley, are organized and some of the best practices. So I'm going to introduce our panelists in a second. Before I want to go real quick on then the agenda, we'll also have an extra panelist that is connected here live. Luca Spissu is connected over Zoom as from Sardinia. I'm going to introduce him as well. This is the very quick agenda. We're going to share some highlights from the report. Also, I'm going to show how you can interact with those data from the online directory. And then we're going to have some conversation here with the entities that are representing not just different countries, but also different areas of how an outpost can support government organizations and their innovation endeavor. And then we're going to give it to Luca to officially launch presence Sardinia as well as a new antenna. And then we'll have probably a good 20 minutes. That's what we schedule for Q&A that is coming from the audience. By the way, the audience that you can see now here, those are all other trade organizations that we've invited. Most of them also participated into the report. So it's going to be kind of an internal conversation on how we see the future and best practices, and how also the current situation is impacting the way that we are organizing our programs. All right. So without further ado, this is the content and the report that we're launching today. A few highlights from the report. I think one of the first data that comes loud and clear is the fact that the presence of government institutions in the Bay Area and in California in general is increasing quite significantly. So it's pretty clear that the innovation is one of the hot topics among government policies, and that's good, obviously. And so in addition to having an historical presence of scale-up corporates, investors, we start seeing more and more government institutions. Now, the research that we've done is fully dedicated into innovation. So just part of organizations that have one of their key elements in the support of innovation. And so we're not filtering consulates or the wide range of a presence, but just the ones that have physical presence here or in the LA area, and where the key element is really support of innovations. And so some of that is coming from parts of a Chamber of Commerce, some are elements of consulate, some are real trade organizations, here we have a couple, and some are, for lack of a better word, bridge organizations, so entities that have a government link that are supporting as a bridge between their own country and California. So speaking of numbers, we have now accounted for 75 innovation outposts. Vast majority are concentrated in Silicon Valley, but it's also historically a significant presence in the Los Angeles area. And those are typically more of a historical trade organization. A few actually of you have also an office in Los Angeles. From I think the historical trade organization presence in a wide populated area that extended some of the activities to innovation. So it's more of an evolution of the traditional trade organizations. Every country is actually represented, 40 countries represented, and they account for a range of 200 to 500 people that are fully dedicated to those activities. Europe seems to be the continent that is mostly represented in the presence of trade organizations. That's actually different from when we count the corporate presence, for example, that represent countries. Asia is much more represented. In this case, actually, Europe seems to be the most represented. Very interestingly, from the countries that are more represented than others, we have 7 outposts from Belgium. And a few from Germany and a few from South Korea. We have a couple from Japan. Again, this is not perfect counting, but I think it gives a good direction of how to slice it. The area establishment, this is by ranges of dates. You can see there is a good amount of activities that have started in the last few years. There's also a few, obviously this increase from the last year and a half or 2 years has somewhat slowed down, but we still have counted, even in the last year, the opening of 2 more or 3 more outposts. And so the flow is not stopped by the current conditions. This is probably the most data-rich slides that we have. Is basically on the left-hand side, we can see the activities that are run by the outpost organizations, and on the horizontal axis, you see where they directed to. So the activities we have organized and grouped them into education activities, physical space, really the idea of hosting not just events, but also the outpost of some of their companies or entities, support of funding, activities of bridging in general that typically requires business development, networking, sometimes also helping to select people that represent companies or startups here, sometimes also the practical support of legal or visa support. And last but not least, the ability to attract investments, so the FDI, attraction and trade, that also potentially as research and trade missions also connected to that in order to create more of a constant flow. And there you can see how things are split between support of activities that can be incubation, acceleration for startups, or just training activities for corporates and government officials. So here you can see, from the numbers, among the entities that we have filtered, what is the incidence of those activities among them. So most organizations tend to have a physical space. Bridging is really at the core of what you guys do. There's still, I think, 3/4 that also have a FDI component to it. And then you see the funding is not central. It's just for a few organizations. This is our kind of methodology of visualizing to what extent you trade organizations prioritize one area versus another. And so we put on a 5-axis chart there on the right-hand side, where you see the component, how important the component that you run is compared to the total amount, and also compared to the others. And so you have a visual view of how is that structure within. On the left-hand side, in the chart on the left-hand side, what you can see is actually a way to organize plotting of strategic positioning of trade organizations that is similar to what we normally do for corporates. So basically, we have divided the external activities. How many actions are you actually putting in place versus the kind of the internal organization and internal alignment as well, and what are the internal KPIs, and the way that there is also an aggressive push to some of the activities that you run there. So based on that, we kind of created 4 different quadrants based on how advanced the activities are, versus a lot of entities are starting first getting aligned before and then moving up and to the right. So being both effective in a strong internal alignment, so strategy from government, and how that translates in the number of actions that we put together. I mean, obviously the entities are here represented are all the kind of the most advanced, that there is a reason why you're here. But the typical path, and is the same one that we've seen for corporates, is to first get an internal strategy and alignment, and then start experimenting a number of actions into the market, so with the outside world. Again, this is more of the effect of the pandemic. interesting statistics as part of the conversation we'll be having with you guys, how the pandemic has changed the way of organizing your activities from entities that were already before fully on site versus entities already were somewhat experimented, some blended formats, to some entities, just a few that already were proposing just fully digital programs pre-pandemic. Obviously, this mix has changed and increased significantly. And then the interesting part is how, and this is part of the interviews that we've had, how do you expect your future to be, right? We're clearly not in a post-pandemic situation now. This is kind of a clear testament of it, but at least I think we can start seeing what we think they will be able to do, and obviously the blended version of delivery programs is by all means the area that everybody is expecting to continue and to push for. So we'll have some conversation about this. Lastly, in terms of physical presence, how important is the physical presence based on also the activities that you are doing. Lean presence is typically 1 or 2 people, a handful of people, maybe in a co-working space. Structured presence is what we identify with your space, your branding, your ability to host events, your ability to host some of your constituencies locally, including with dedicated areas and desks. And so we're gonna obviously go through different models here, but that's how the split looks. This is more on the deal flow or amount of activities that come your way. And so on the first part, you see based on all the different programs that you might be running for startups, for corporates, for government organizations, how many come your way? So what is your selection funnel? How many you communicate to, how many eventually apply if there is an application process? And so the vast majority you see here from this chart tend to have around 100 to 250 amount of applications of their programs. And then the amount of entities that you deliver those to, you see at the bottom, and again, it's very kind of spread out, but is on the average is 25 to 50 per year. Again, it changes quite a bit, actually. You can see really a pretty wide range of it. Also, the interesting part is, especially when we talk about KPIs, some of you are very sophisticated about that, very explicit about those. What is the impact? And job creation is definitely one of the key ones, as for everybody. And again, this is the average across a large range. Most of the entities actually do not disclose that number. Very hard to track. The ones that they disclose, those are kind of ranges that we average out. And also the amount of support to entities to open the setup of their branches, right? So this is one of the key elements to it. And if there is a cap support or capital raise, again, what is the KPIs that you are showing? 200 from 100 to 150 million, and also commercial deals. That is the other side of the support, this bilateral support. Education and acceleration, again, it's a wide range here. Educational services can be occasional or custom, or you can have a number of activities that typically repeats over the years. You can see how is the split. Or immersion programs. Immersion programs are programs that are typically a little bit more condensed, 2, 3, 4 weeks. Are those custom, or are those current that they keep repeating? Acceleration, this is kind of a catch-all kind of a word, but the idea of having programs that are fully dedicated to accelerate entities. Those are typically either SMEs or startups. Still a few that don't run those, a few that actually have discontinued the typical acceleration programs that they used to run. But still a good number of them that provide multiple acceleration programs per year. And the cohort is typically in the 1,000 people as a range of 10 to 25. Trade mission, and I think this is the last slides that we have. Trade mission, actually they're and FDI, two separate and different area here. Transmission is definitely one of the activities that happens the most often. The targets might be different: managers, entrepreneurs, corporates, investors, and more also policymakers that we want to expose to the world of innovation, Silicon Valley and LA area. The FDI has its own way then of counting the number of flow of business that come both ways, both as bilateral trade agreements, and here is the average of export deal value, import deal value that you can see, as well as the pure attraction of capital, right? And see, this is, as we said before, 3 out of 4 government organizations have that as one of the key elements, and the average of the FDI value that we have tracked is around half a billion dollars as a total amount. I think that's all I have. Yeah, so that's how where you can also find this data. And the interesting part that we launched last week is also a new interactive way to browse this data, and actually to go and browse really where the outposts are located. And so maybe if I can do a real quick review of how that works. This is in the is actually in our website. Is open to everybody. Let me actually, I probably need to reload it. This is where this information can be found, and the reports can be found, and this is where all those directories can actually be in. We have a bunch of those, and so it's open to be explored. You go on inside and you find also a way to filter all the outpost organization. There is a card for every outpost organization. You can view it in a map, and so you can zoom in and see who is where. And then if you want to do some specific sub search on which area of the FDI or whatnot, you can go and see and find more information. So again, kind of an easier way to use this data. All right, I think I'm done talking. Now up to our panelists here, and the idea is with this data to kick off the kind of conversation, some of the insights that you might be having. So I think first of all, I'll let you introduce you and your organization. Maybe give a range of activities that you do. In the areas that we've seen, what makes you really different, or which part you cover the most, and then we can have a few conversations. I would start this way with Gioia.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you so much for being here, but also the report is actually super interesting. It's very helpful for us always to understand what others are doing and how we sort of fit into a wider landscape. So I'm Gioia, I'm the CEO of Swissnex. I believe we might be the oldest outpost in the Bay Area. We've been here for over 18 years now. So we were truly one of the first, or if not the first, I believe the actual first that dedicated to innovation. And I'd like to highlight maybe a few things that stood out to me that are different from what is described here. So I think one key thing for us is we are rooted in science. Our home is science, it's not trade, it's not commerce, it's not business. So Swissnex comes and is associated with the State Secretariat of Science, Education and Research. That's one key difference. So we have a very strong vocation in supporting research collaborations, science collaborations, and innovation collaborations as they relate to science and technology. So I think that's one key aspect I would like to highlight in terms of what differentiates us. Another aspect, I don't see that covered in the report, but I guess is the funding structure. So we are a public-private partnership that will probably go under bridge organization. We do emanate from the government, the State Secretariat for Education, Research and Innovation is mentioned, but we do have to bring in 2/3 of our own funding through projects with any kind of stakeholder that is willing to pay for the services we provide. So that's often a key differentiator. I think some of the other outposts are fully funded. It does create a very different DNA on the one hand and pressure on the other hand. The last 18 months have been disastrous for us, as an example, as you can probably imagine. And so I think that's another key differentiator. And then The last piece is, so our focus is truly innovation collaboration. So it's less trade. We do have an organization dedicated to that, the Swiss Business Hub. They actually do trade, export promotion, FDI promotion. We don't. We truly work on the science part and fostering collaborations between actors at a very early stage. So the tricky part there is, how do you make money with that?
Yeah.
Trade, you can actually make money with it somehow because there's money gained, money made. And so we are always a little bit in that tricky zone that is not fully commercial in terms of what we do, but then on the other hand, we do have to bring in our own money, and that creates an interesting tension.
And that's a great element that I would like to bring to the discussion, because it's definitely, I think also the potential future growth and self-sustainability of some of those outposts, and so we'll have a conversation. So let's keep with the introduction. Nori, JETRO.
Yeah, thank you for having me today, Marco. It was a great report and interesting report to us. And I'm Noriya Tarutani, Executive Director of JETRO San Francisco. Please call me Nori. And we are government-related organizations which helps world trade and investment between Japan and the rest of the world. And I thought we are the oldest organization in the area, but with 70 years history, but 80 years history, amazing. So I'm very surprised that Swissnex has been 80 years history. But
18.
18.
18. Yeah. Okay, I don't know if you're 70 years or 18.
Yeah. And also, what we do here is to help a Japanese startup expanding their business overseas in the Bay Area. And we help US startups to set up office in Japan as well. And in the process of supporting the US startup, we coordinated the US startup to the Japanese corporations, a larger corporation in Bay Area, as in terms of open innovations. And our, recent success story is, for example, DoorDash, which is a unicorn company, also standard recognition as an app. And we focus on startup innovations and to attract best startups to Japanese ecosystem.
And you also have offices in Los Angeles area?
Yes, we have 2 offices in California with San Francisco and with Los Angeles. And also we have another 4 offices in USA, New York, Chicago, Atlanta, and Houston. And we have Canada, 1 office in Canada.
Penny, your turn, London Partners.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marco. Lovely to be here and meet you as well. So I'm Penny Harwood. I'm the SVP of Business Development at London & Partners, and we are the business growth and destination agency for London. We're a not-for-profit organisation that seeks to attract investment into Greater London. And once companies land in London, we have a variety of different programmes to support them as they look to scale, very much as an entry point into London, the UK and the EMEA market. London Partners has been in existence for about 10 years. Prior to that, we were here in the Valley, actually. We've been here for about 14 years or so. We were much more focused on FDI, but over these last, in particular, the last 5 years or so, we've developed a program to support trade. So we support trade and investment, and I'm based here with some colleagues. We have an office in LA, also Toronto, Chicago, and New York. Part of our mission is very much about creating good growth for London, and we do so in a resilient, sustainable and inclusive way. So we're very, we do a lot to support those various initiatives. Once companies land in London, so we provide a lot of support as they look to expand into Greater London. We run a variety of different programs. One is an accelerator called the Business Growth Program. That's a 3-month program that seeks to support London and international smaller companies as they're looking to really understand how to better scale. We run workshops and lots of sort of meet the corporate events for them. We also run the trade program, which we call the Mayor's International Business Program, and that has now supported over 1,000 companies across a variety of core sectors, including tech and fintech, urban life sciences, and innovation and the creative sectors. And with those companies, we also run workshops. We also connect them into mentors. It's a lot about kind of education, but we also bring them on trade missions around the world, and Silicon Valley is a popular place for them. We can talk about that more. Thank you.
And similar to Swissnex, you also kind of a blended organization, partly funded and partly, you know, self-sustained?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are a mixture of public and private, about 50% funded by the Mayor of London, by the GLA, and the rest comes from other private partners, grants, etc. We're very entrepreneurial as an organization, and that sort of speaks to some of the programs that we run to.
Alberto Acito, ICEITA,
Thank you,
FDI.
Marco. Thank you, Marco, for inviting me here today. Nice to meet you all. And the Italian Trade Organization is actually a government-led traditional trade organizations. We have 78 offices all around the world. Many are actually in the US, and 20 of these are in fact focused on foreign direct investments. And I do represent the organization around FDI in San Francisco. We're kind of a bit of a latecomer in the Silicon Valley, I have to say. We're closing the gap very, very quickly. We are also supported by the Italian consulate. We have 2 offices, one in LA, one in San Francisco. And the main goal is clearly to support the growth and expansion of Italian companies abroad. That's what really kind of the aim and the DNA of the organization. In the last few years, we've tried to kind of close the gap supporting also startups. So we have built a major program called Global Startup Program. Actually, Marinucci has been a partner in this, and trying to kind of shift the number of activities from just doing marketing and promotion and supporting corporates to also let's say also create innovation programs, and that's what we do.
So you're part of this trend that we were mentioning before of how innovation is you know, moving up in a ranking of priorities of government agendas, and hence using the traditional trade organization also to support that. And that's your flow, you know, from being historically based in Los Angeles, but then adding pieces of support of innovation startups, and not only, there's more to come, by the way, and moving also some of the central gravity to Silicon Valley because of those reasons is a flow that we have seen and experienced by a number of organizations here.
Yeah, you're touching a major point, and in your report, I think it was clearly stated 2/3 of the number of trade and investment organizations in the Silicon Valley have been created in the last 10 years. That's clearly like probably the most important metric to actually confirm how government and tech are getting closer and closer together. I think this is a major topic, and how this nexus actually creates value for both parties is really the biggest challenge. And I hope we can discuss more about it.
It's actually one of the interesting evolution of that we have seen here for a few organizations, that starting a organization that first supports innovation here, and then becoming so important that will start also adding consulary activities connected to it. We've seen with the Danish organizations and with other, that's how their history of development. And so that it essentially started as a entity that is supporting innovation, and then becoming so important that would add also the opposite. So the consulary support that before it wasn't intended. So interesting dynamic. I would say let's start with how the pandemic has impacted everybody's activity, and maybe starting from Swissnex, this is kind of a related question to it. Swissnex has been, I think, for your visibility and your beautiful space that you have right at the edge of the water, always, I think, an example for many, to look up to. So how is the last year and a half have impacted also the sustainability of the model that you're running?
Yeah, it's a good question.
It's also
a tough question. Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think what I would say is that it has accelerated, like on so many levels. It has accelerated something that had been happening for a while, and our model was under strain for a while. That's not what you see when you walked into our space and it looks fantastic and amazing, and it looks like we've got it all figured out. But I'll be honest with you, we don't. It's a model that's been financially under strain for quite a while, definitely since we moved into that space, which is very, very fantastic, but also a huge financial burden. And what the pandemic accelerated in many ways is for us to really do some soul searching on what is the next pioneering function we have. And I find it very interesting what was just discussed, because trade organizations, traditional trade organizations, have moved into the innovation space, as have consulates and embassies. Swissnex used to be alone in a field that nobody else was even looking at. That was science diplomacy, and it was innovation diplomacy or technology diplomacy.
And art, by the way.
And of course, art is a very big part for us as well. And that is still in many ways the differentiator, art, the intersection of technology and science. And in the last few years, many other organizations, including Swiss organizations, have entered the field and have a little bit squeezed our existence, our raison d'être in many ways. And so have made us wonder, what is truly the next pioneering role we need to have in order to be that scout that is way ahead of everybody else, way ahead of traditional government, right? And that figures out what needs to be done next. And so this has really triggered a much more accelerated way of doing that soul searching, because we financially really suffered from this blow, had to let go part of the team, which was very painful. And we have engaged in a huge change process. So what is reflected in the report is kind of the old Swissnex, to be honest. Mm-hmm. And the new Swissnex is currently being born, and it becomes a less activity-based organization, a much more impact-based organization. And I won't say too much about it, but our focus will be much more on transforming individuals, young innovators. Well, they don't have to be young, actually, age-wise. We call them next generation innovators, can be any age, and in turning them into change makers. Because another big trend we see are the global challenges that we face as humanity, and how does an organization like Swissnex, that is at the intersection of science, technology, innovation, business, government, what is our unique role that we can play in accelerating the actual best ideas that are out there around solving issues like climate change, technology and society, et cetera, in order to bring those ideas into being and accelerating them. So that's really going to be our focus. So quite away from the traditional, anything that comes our way, we help you, but being much more impact focused and working on impact metrics. But
what you said though is so true, that people and the ecosystem here is looking at Swissnex as the trailblazer by a number of different measures. And so very excited to see your next incarnation, on how is that producing models that others will look up to one way or the other. So
fingers crossed.
Still, pandemic impact was something to add in general.
Yeah, actually, we have seen a lot of benefits in building networks in Silicon Valley. Before the pandemic, it was very difficult for us to arrange a business meeting between Japanese corporation and investors or potential companies here in Bay Area, because they are very busy. They are contacted by all startups all over the world. But it's easier right now to ask investor to squeeze 15, 30 minutes to allocate a business meeting with our startups. So this is a good point. And besides one-to-one business meeting, and for program activities, we have offered more program than before the pandemic. Actually, we have launched a sector-based acceleration program, including top 6 accelerators here in Bay Area, including Alchemist, so Youth Berkeley Skylake, and CIC, Cambridge Innovation Centers, and YS Plug and Play, World Innovation Lab, and Texters. And those top 6 accelerator is willing to provide an online bootcamp or online acceleration program either. It was quite difficult to run those 6 acceleration parallelly if we do a physical acceleration program, right? So that's why we provided more service in terms of quality and quantity right now.
And so do you think that this is going to change for good the way that you're providing your services to your startups?
Oh, it's a good point. It depends on the pandemic, but during the pandemic, we could build a numerous network with US investors and accelerators. So we will be able to utilize those networks after the pandemic, I believe.
Yeah. How about London Partners?
So London and Partners. So on the trade side, I mentioned missions. We were running in-person missions all around the world, and we literally pivoted. We changed a mission which was an EdTech focused mission to New York in May into a virtual mission, and that kind of set the stage for the ability for us to widen out the opportunity for our scale-ups from London to understand the broader North American market. So rather than necessarily bringing them to a certain city in North America like New York or LA, San Francisco, Seattle, etc., we were able to really showcase the broad opportunities and actually work with economic development agencies all around the, the kind of broader, both Canada and the US. So since then, we've run 7 missions. They've all been sector focused, so cyber, digital health, fintech, creative. We also ran a really exciting one in partnership with Manchester in the summer, which was a REACH mission, which was to support underrepresented founders from both London and Manchester. And the great thing about that was being able to help them sort of understand, the cities and the sort of the opportunities in various cities, but also connect them into investors and also corporates here. There's a real appetite to understand what this innovation is that's coming out from kind of the broader UK, London, and in that example, Manchester as well. On the flip side, helping companies and the network here understand kind of what's going on in the UK, we've actually done a pretty good job. We're very kind of happy with how it's gone. So there, there's always a silver lining, even though it's been a challenging year for everybody. We ran earlier in the spring of this year an LGBTQ+ IA mission, first of its kind virtual mission, again for founders all across North America into London. We had the Nighttime Czar hosting them in London virtually, and a range of partners and networks. But it really was, for us, it's very much about kind of creating community, and that was very successful as well. And as we speak, London Tech Week is taking place in London. So it's a very exciting conference that we are a co-founder of. And as we speak, there is a virtual mission actually in London from Denver and Colorado. So our team in LA has been working very closely with some scale-ups there to help them with that. I should also mention what's been happening in London kind of post-pandemic is that when we're talking about kind of innovation and open innovation, we opened something or created an initiative called the Open Innovation Fellowship, which is to work specifically with corporates and people, sort of the heads of innovation or kind of want to be heads of innovation, sort of sponsored by their sort of C-suite, to bring them into an educational program which lasts for 4 months, where they become fellows and get to learn from each other, from other corporates about what open innovation means, kind of access parts of London that they might not, and networks that they might not necessarily have been able to do so without the support from our program, and then take these learnings. Actually been doing this in collaboration with the Royal College of Art, and then take these learnings back into their own companies to further kind of instill and kind of change things, and sort of the change maker aspect. And we've had great feedback so far.
It's great to see how creative, that entities have become. Some of the programs that you are describing are fantastic. Sound very intriguing. Alberto, have we learned much, or what have we learned? Is there any lessons learned from the last year and a half of how we can do things?
I would say as a trade organization, obviously the most obvious impact has been the drop in trade missions. I mean, so what we call here in Silicon Valley, as well, the safari tours. And I guess this is definitely one of the positives that is going to come out of
safari is
more juice. Exactly. And in fact, if I have to pick up one positive development of what we're doing now, is a more curated and focused approach in creating value for companies and businesses, whether it is startups or corporates. Yeah. And this is not a given for government organizations. It might be very relevant for private organizations, but when it comes to government, a more focused, curated consulting approach is something that is not part of the DNA. So that's actually what's happening today. So we're really building a pipeline approach with regards to projects, and obviously that goes without saying for FDI. this is part of the way we work, but that's not obvious for other types of approach. And so this is really something that I see kind of becoming more and more relevant. Another angle is building experience with digital. Again, you know, government organizations are not really typically have not been traditionally typically able to address new technologies or way, you know, to build programs using digital and platform. And I'm giving you an example. Probably JP Morgan, the JP Morgan conference is one of the most important investment that the ITA does every year. It's the largest event in San Francisco, and definitely in the pharma and biotech space is the most important in the world. We've been very consistent in investing with an actual presence during JP Morgan conference since 2015, both with you know, kind of open events, but as well with pitch sessions with biotech startups. So it's been kind of one relevant, let's say, investment done. This year, we completely shifted this to digital, and that's something that we've never done, and it worked fine. And obviously, there were lessons learned. The platform itself that was used was actually built in a relatively short period of time. But that's a learning curve that needs to happen. And I think this is really where we're going. And I can only see a positive thing coming out of that. Now, do we have the right resources, skill set, talents to keep kind of growing? That's probably the challenge and the question mark.
Yeah, this crash course in digitization, I think, is I mean, it's true across the board, especially with government that typically, you know, are not the leaders, more followers. But I think this is definitely forcing a lot of soul searching, but more of a, you know, being a little bit closer to digital options that are plenty out there. On the contrary, that's another point I wanted to make, but it seems that still physical space matter for a number of reasons. And I'm looking at you because, again, you're coming from a history of being very visible for that. But regardless, we're counting now in the last year, still several large countries that are looking for a physical space where the model of a Swissnex can be somewhat repeated with under the same umbrella, bringing different angles of a presence of different entities. Sometimes is you know, the science, sometimes is the support to other corporates and whatnot. So it seems that they're kind of a counterintuitive flow that I've tried to still now believe that concentration under the same umbrella and finding a physical space actually still matters, if not matters more than before. Any thought about this?
I can pick on this.
You can pick because you're hot in
the space. Yeah, and in fact, in a very much of a contrarian action, Italy has decided during the pandemic to open an Italian cultural and innovation hub in San Francisco. So that's kind of, you know, something of recently announced. It's going to be officially inaugurated very soon. The place is there, is downtown San Francisco, is between Jackson and Sansons, is 2 floors, 12,000 square feet. And we're actually now working to design what the space is going to look like practically.
It's a beautiful space, by the way. I've seen it. And,
yes, it's really beautiful. It's really beautiful. And there is a great opportunity, of course, to think about it and to design, like Gioia, you were saying, about how to build these spaces for the future in an hybrid or post-pandemic world. But it's a contrarian view. But if you think about it, it's not really. I mean, governments do understand that whatever they do and whatever they will be doing in the future as they become more relevant for driving growth. And let's think about, you know, next generation EU plan, you know, recovery plans. Each and every of those pillars have technology at the core. So governments do understand that technology is something that they don't understand. And that's traditionally been the case in many ways. You know, it's always been very tough to put technology in the agenda. But now, you know, time is over. You know, we need to kind of go down and play on the field. And that's why I think investing in a project like this makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because they understand, governments do understand that they need to know more about, and that's really besides the trade kind of missions and FDI. This is really about understanding technology and connecting to big techs, having a conversation. I would say this investment for Italy puts also Italy on the map with regards to the tech diplomacy and type of conversations. You know, our consulates, our governments are actually able to engage in a conversation with technology stakeholders to drive, obviously, policy making.
Yeah.
And
And Italy is not alone, by the way, in that endeavor. I think we're, Germany, France are doing similar activities, and it's happening now. It's not 4 years ago.
Yes.
I mean, it's obviously a process that is starting from much before, but I think it's reinforcing what you just said, really the awareness that a little investment that can be visual but can bring a lot of returns, culturally speaking, in a digitization of the country where technology is clearly at the core. Gioia, tell us a little bit more, how were you using the space today, just to give also a sense of which kind of activities can be hosted in the case of Swissnex, and what else can be done once you have this investment? Because obviously the overarching question here, how sustainable that is. If it's government as an investment, it makes perfect sense. If it's not, what are other areas that can be looked at as a
Yeah, I think this is one of the key topics on our minds right now. Like, our space has basically been pretty much empty for the last 18 months. Our team goes back. We do have a resident community. It's important to know. Like, that's a big part of our income was companies. So all innovation-based actors, universities that are having a presence in our space and paying for their presence. Many of them, especially the Swiss ones that were here every once in a while, pulled out because they haven't been able to travel. Now, luckily, there is a change on the horizon, but
since yesterday.
Yeah. But I think that probably has affected all of us in a way similarly. And if you bank on space as an income source, that was very difficult. And then there was this whole question if we even need office or not. Right? So, but that to say that the space really started to become much less prominent in how we do our work. Now going forward, we're thinking of new models to monetize the space because we have it. So let's think of it as an income source in a more sustainable way, rather than one-on-one picking individual people that have a desk there that pays almost nothing. Like, what are sort of bigger ways we can monetize the space? So that's one key question going forward, but that only against the background of how can we continue using our space as a living lab for the future of work. We've always done that, but we are again now sitting at the table with JETRO, which is the Swiss design company that has done the initial design of our space as a partner, actually, where we had engaged in conversations about the future of work and modeled that out in our space. So we continue that, and we brought in a local partner, O+A. It's a big design from workplace design firm that's done some of the big campuses that we know of. And we're actually engaging in a redesign of our space. It's a pure partnership, so there's no monetary transaction there, and really using our space as a blank canvas and say, okay, how can we model new ways of using space in our office? And we bring in technology partners. So the idea is also to make our space a truly hybrid space, fit for hybrid purposes. So it's not that you have to set all of that up, but it's somehow built in that we can use the space in flexible ways and use different nooks and niches for different kinds of hybrid purposes as well. So there's a whole rethinking, and then I'd be happy to, since you guys are just starting that process, share some of the insights there. And I think there's a lot of cross-peer learning that we can do, all of us who operate spaces, you guys too, with Mind the Bridge. What is the future of space, and to what extent will we use these kinds of spaces for these kinds of events, right? Like, we don't know. And for us, it's just an exploration at this point. We are going to just experiment with different models.
Yeah. Let me just say, for the audience there, for the other trade organizations are connected, if you want also to start posting questions, we're more than happy to cover as the conversation flows. Otherwise, we'll have some dedicated time in the second part. Anything to add there? You guys have less of a focus on space. I would probably try to steer the conversation into the self-sustainability of some of these activities, which is business model behind True that we didn't put any specific data point out there, but I think there's still probably 1/3 of those organizations that at a certain point will have to bring some sustainability, self-sustainability in their programs. You too, I think you were designed from the beginning to be a partnership, private public. Any suggestions for entities that are starting now looking at that as a potential model to grow in general? Some of your lessons learned and insight that in your case is very at the core of why London Partners is so successful.
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of historically we have moved away from the amount of funding necessarily from the public side to more of the kind of the private side. So as I mentioned, we're very entrepreneurial as an organization, and that one of the programs that I just mentioned, the Open Innovation Fellowship, is actually revenue generating for us. So that is one example. We don't sort of make any money from other of the sort of the regular trade and investment, but we're continually kind of looking for ways for kind of creativity in terms of ways to bring in more income to allow us to kind of grow and then sort of reinvest back into the organization. So I'd say probably that's one of the most relevant kind of newer ones. I don't know if there's anything from your side.
Yeah, I would say the tricky thing if you're associated with government is always that comes with an expectation of public service, and that has been our hardest sort of schizophrenic part of our nature, right? It's like, oh, but you're public service, but I pay taxes, so why don't I get this for free? And I don't know if you face any of that, but we definitely do. For us, the turn will be, we also have restrictions on what we're even allowed to charge as the government, because we're still associated with government. So we have a given rate that we're allowed to charge per the Swiss Confederation, no matter whether we sit in India or in San Francisco. And we have offices in India, that's why I mentioned that. And that, of course, creates a big problem, right? Because, I mean, $100 in India is not the same as $100 in San Francisco, and we have to pay our staff here locally. They have to pay their staff there locally. So these are really important questions that we're now addressing at the centralized level and saying, okay, either we are government, but then we need to be funded in such a way that the MVP is always functioning. This is something we learned in the pandemic. Our MVP was already not working, right? Because we are funding a big part of our MVP ourselves. But if you have an MVP that is always working, then you can grow on top of that. And you can focus on that as in some ways, nice to have, right? But it's not funding necessarily your very existence. And our model is going too deep into funding our very existence that it has truly created major issues for us to focus on things where we think it will make the most sense, where we have the most impact versus where we can make the most money. And that creates a very bizarre dynamic sometimes. So, I mean, I don't know how you guys, I'm super curious how you guys are going to fund the center and what the questions are that you're addressing. So
you've touched on a couple of very interesting topics, Gioia. I mean, for us, it's really an experiment, and this is great. This is great, and I've very rarely seen the Italian government actually launching itself into an experiment, into an MVP, like you just said. And so the idea behind this project is, in fact, to create a true value proposition for Italy that is integrated, bringing together several pieces of government entities that traditionally have always worked separately together under the same floor.
It's actually very similar, by the way, to
Swissnex,
where the cultural side is also well embedded.
Absolutely. They've been our inspiration, to be honest, and I'm very happy to see that. And so having led the government to actually try this experiment has been really the driver. These entities have, again, traditionally worked separately, and so building a value prop that is integrated. I'm thinking about Italy, and we would think about food, culture, design, all of these elements that have really a little nexus with tech and Silicon Valley are, in fact, for us, very important because they belong to the tradition, they belong to the, let's say, emotional, let's say, connections with even with technology, big techs and startups. So how do we leverage our core values in this new space? So the idea of having a space where all these organizations within Italy work together to build something relevant for the Silicon Valley, because we have traditionally spoken about what we can get from Silicon Valley back home. The reality is that there is a lot that we can give. And none of the government organizations have really done that soul searching type of exercise to understand, yeah, really, but what can I add on the table in a place like the Silicon Valley, who's shaping literally the way we live. So that's in theory. Now, practically, we need to do the work. And so, which brings me then to the actual challenge, Marco, that also you tapped, I guess, in the report somewhere, which is talent and competency and skill set. So these are very complex exercise as opposed to a cookie cutter approach to this type of projects. We do need to step up a bit and do the work in a kind of a more kind of professional way, and so that's a real challenge, I guess.
And I have to say that one of the main drivers for us to start putting not just this research, but also a modeling or an attempt of the modeling behind where you can measure. It's really along those lines of creating references where each entity can compare themselves against, so you can get a sense in which path am I on. And some of that is legacy. And some of that, I think, accelerated by the pandemic is what should I be and why, right? So really the soul searching, and you need to have some modeling. And that's the same thing that we've been doing with corporates that are much more structured by design. But I think the process is actually pretty similar. Yeah, you need to start measuring first of all.
Yeah, and I think KPIs are super important. And just to add on what I was saying, the kind of attempt that we are doing as an organization is to build kind of a sort of partnership with private organizations and have this exchange. So the actual space is going to be run by a private team, by a private organization, because we believe that they can add so much value into managing, but also into building new concepts. So it's going to be a very interesting exercise, but then we need to measure that. Yeah, and we have 4 years to go, let's say at least,
yeah.
Can I just sort of pick up on that as well? I mean, not so much in terms of kind of revenue, but sort of, making it sustainable is kind of the partnering kind of important aspect. It's incredibly important. So certainly for both of all of our activities, both trade and investment, our partners are very, very important. In particular on the trade side, whether it's kind of corporate partners or whether it's sort of service providers as well. So in terms of you were saying about adding value. So if we're not able to necessarily kind of fund things ourselves, if we can form some strategic partnerships with other organizations where there's mutual value on both sides, we're kind of bringing content, we're bringing innovation to them, we're showcasing the amazing, in our case, the amazing kind of scale up in the community, kind of bringing that to them, and then they're also sort of reciprocating in terms of being able to access them and kind of feed in and sort of becoming part of this broader ecosystem. It's incredibly valuable. So I think that's one of the main things that, aside from resilience, one of the big things that we've really learned through this pandemic has been this aspect of collaboration and partnership. We all have to, as a world, but then kind of when we come into our micro worlds, it's incredibly important.
Yeah, and I want to touch on that. But before that, we talked about KPIs, and I'm looking at you because I think London Partners is one of the most explicit in your communication, in also the fact that you're probably public-private organization also, makes that aspect more of a priority. But you share very nicely your KPIs at the beginning and after the fact. So give us a little bit of a overview of which kind of KPIs you run internally, and if you have any specific best practice or suggestion for other organizations that are not there yet, but it should, not just because of the public, but also because of internal organizations.
Yeah, I mean, our KPIs, so the core of what we do is looking at the creation of gross value add. So we have a evaluation kind of methodology, which is public. It's on our website, and I'm very happy to share it if you'd like to kind of, those who are attending today, they want to look through it. It's quite a meaty overview. Essentially, the sort of the GVA on the FDI side is looking at the number of jobs that are created in each of the core sectors that I mentioned. Each job has an economic value, and then we look at the year 3 numbers of kind of projected job growth for Greater London, and then we have a kind of a calculator that essentially kind of works out what the GVA is for that. On the trade side, we do look to some degree at the jobs that are being created, but we also look at the sort of the value of the export wins, so that kind of contract those successes, and then that also feeds into the GVA kind of big pie. I mean, we're also the destination agency for London, so we also attract visitors and conventions and congresses and events to London. So there's also an aspect of kind of measuring that sort of economic spend. Of course, that has been impacted during COVID, but we're seeing that kind of tick up again. We've got some very healthy bookings actually in terms of the sort of the venues in the next couple of years. So things are looking up, and also, that's another learning is we're here kind of hybrid is to sort of move into this hybrid world, but essentially we'll be going back to a lot more kind of connection and kind of being with people. But hopefully that helps in terms of kind of.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is how important is that to your daily activities? So are the KPIs a good, mission-driven, force that would help you be aligned and focus on what you're doing, or becomes more a distraction or an overhead? Because there's always a balance between the two, right? When you're measuring too much, becomes more of a sometimes a burden rather than a helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly important to us because that is how we're measured, and we have to fulfill on the sort of the mission of what we do. So we're very focused around the sort of the sectors that we work in, but I would say the caveat there is kind of broadly, our presence here is very much about being the experts on the Greater London region, building the community here, building the network. So we're very, very active around kind of working with different stakeholders within our various regions within North America. So we're very much about kind of telling that story and representing that kind of the brand and the values of what London means for investment, for, investment and trade. You can't, there is a net kind of value of that in terms of some kind of aspects, but some of that is kind of a little bit harder to measure. So it is a little bit of a balance. But we are very focused on, being as successful as we can.
Noriya, I want to talk about partnership and the importance of local partnerships, in particular, how to maintain and nurture local partnerships, but that become then successful to you as an organization. I mean, JETRO has been very active, and we were mentioning that the amount of partners that you have just for the acceleration is the who's who of the world of a startup acceleration. Any suggestions, any best practice on how to maintain a healthy network where you give and take, and we know how important that is, in particular in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, how we can provide value-added service to our business partner, which is very important. So even if the temporary program finished, we continue to provide market information relating to Japanese ecosystem, and we are introduce the best startup or best corporate to venture capital or any accelerator or business partners in Bay Area. And one of the good example is a joint study report with MindBridge. We have published the report named the Japanese Corporate Innovation in Bay Area. And those reports includes 85 companies list of the Japanese corporation here in Bay Area. And every time we receive the inquiry, what kind of corporation in the Bay Area, Japanese corporation in Bay Area. We distributed those reports to them, and also we curated what kind of cooperation will fit your sector or vertical. And every time I receive the inquiry, we introduce those companies to startups or to accelerate or to venture capital, and that makes us very strong network with a local ecosystem.
Yeah, to say the JETRO does a particularly good job at that. I think the topic related to that is something that government typically don't do usually, is to get a feedback loop from the partners, the ecosystem that you're dealing with. And we didn't add it into that report, but really sometimes it's also what is the brand value that us or you as a trade organization have in an ecosystem. Sometimes there is a mismatch of what is considered to be the brand value and what actually the local ecosystem see of you. And sometimes, it's the lack of flexibility, the fact that you need to bring in, a number of processes that are typically not so compatible with the local ecosystem. So I think that cycle of feedback is something that should be fully incorporated today, in particular for the more traditional trade organizations that is still missing there. There was a first question that I will start looking at more on the new normal. David is asking the new normal of remote work, short-term productivity, but bad for long-term innovation. Do you agree with that? This is a study that David said it was referenced at Microsoft. Remote work, does it work or does it not? This is a very general, topic, I have to say. But
well, if I can tackle this, I don't know that is bad for long-term innovation. I see actually this probably being, and I'm talking for Italy, which is in the innovation, let's say, spectrum, probably not the country that comes up top of mind, is a great opportunity. I mean, tapping into talent that is located in peripheral cities in Europe, let's say, or in countries that have traditionally not been able to make that talent available for many reasons. London clearly is the hub that everybody from the Bay Area think when they're going to Europe, and as an example. And now we have the opportunity to make this talent available to the whole industry. And so I think we should be working on that. And the idea of having a presence here is actually to do that. One of the goals that I think that we want to have is exactly to make that the talent available. Now, clearly, we need tools, and we need also in Italy, processes in place, and also law and regulations to make this happen. But I see personally this to be probably one of the most interesting opportunities for growth and to leverage technology as a tool for economic growth and ultimately work. Yeah.
And before we start opening for Q&A, I think that we set the stage for Luca Spissu from Sardinia as a part of the launch of a new antenna. So we were discussing that even during the pandemic, there are a few new activities that have been planned. So Luca, the floor is yours, and maybe if you have also some specific questions that then after you present what you guys are planning to do, you want from the panelists that have been here for 15, 18, 19 years and counting.
Thank you, Marco. I'm impressed. I'm impressed on what I've learned in this meeting, especially because a lot of questions you addressed to the speakers were more or less the same questions I would have liked to address to you and Alberto during the last month. So I have a lot of answers now. And few words about the organization I'm representing now. It's extremely important because now we are operating on behalf of the whole region, the autonomous region of Sardinia. Those who are not familiar with the Mediterranean Sea, Sardinia is the second biggest island of the Mediterranean Sea. And actually, we are operating on behalf of of the entire region within a program of internationalization, I would say. Now, so we have to be grateful to the local Ministry of Programming and Finance, because during our last journey in San Francisco, you should remember, we discussed about the possibility of opening an antenna in San Francisco, and we were together with him, the local Ministry of Programming and Finance, and his director. And actually, the reason why ASPAL, which is an acronym which stands for Regional Agency for Active Labor Policies, the reason why this organization is managing this project is, I mean, could summarize as follows, more or less. First of all, we have been implementing a training program for aspiring entrepreneurs for a long time, I mean, 3 or 4 years. So during the recent past, we financed measures fully dedicated to aspiring entrepreneurs to be trained, and by chance, all activities were run and managed and carried out in San Francisco. So for my organization, there was the necessity to, let's say, to ensure a kind of continuity. So to be supported by a stable organization capable of providing education and training programs for aspiring entrepreneurs. This is the first. The second one is that the local Ministry of Programming and Finance is responsible for enhancing the entrepreneurial ecosystem here in Sardinia, and then there was the need to have more connections with the rest of the world. And Silicon Valley was chosen amongst different destinations and different locations. And for him and for his offices, it was important to have this kind of support to benefit from service, to feed ideas of aspiring entrepreneurs, to look for partners and investors. So this was the request. But of course, given our structure and our mission, it was also necessary for us to, let's say, to mix up a little bit the need which was coming from another directory to the need of my organization. And this is the result of this effort, which was completed just a few weeks ago when there was the kickoff meeting of the contract, was the following. So at the end of the discussion, we concluded that Mind the Bridge, which is our technical partner for our antenna, represents the, let's say, the ideal technical partner for trying to imagine, for drawing up reports on specific issues. To be more precise, in our programming documents, we have a lot of so-called strategic sectors on which we should concentrate our attention in the future. At the same time, those experts who have imagined the list of those strategic sectors sometimes do not have a clear idea about the possible developments in future. So with respect to this point, the Mind the Bridge could represent for us, and the antenna in San Francisco represent for us a chance, an opportunity to, let's say, I use different words, I mean, to express my ideas, to predict the future. What does it mean? It means that our public officials could learn from reports prepared in an environment which is represented by California and Silicon Valley, which for us represent what could happen in the next 10 to 15 years. And those lessons learned through reports, data, information, and other kind of, let's say, and data could represent for us an inspiring path for designing our future strategic sector and activities. So for us, the antenna is designed for supporting the private sector, entrepreneurs and inspired entrepreneurs, but as public administration and also as public official, I have imagined this antenna for supporting also the action, activities, knowledge, and ability and competencies of my colleagues who could benefit from this activity. At the same time, and this is the third pillar, let's say, we think that Sardinia could be defined as a land or potential opportunity of investment. And we are, but at the same time, we are quite aware about the fact that it's not exactly well known in the rest of the world. So the antenna could represent an ideal platform for informing, let's say, potential investors here, taking into account that we think that we have something to offer to that place. This is more or less the reason why we have planned to have the antenna. And at the same time, I would say also taking advantage of what the speaker have told me and told us during the intervention. I would say that this is an experiment. Yeah, sometimes my supervisors, my directors have asked me, why are we doing that? And the normal answer is exactly what I'm telling you. It could be defined as an experiment. First of all, because I mean, we think that the public administration should play the role of trying to fill in the gap of kind of market failure. So it is incredible for us that no one private actor has managed to even to imagine to do that. But we think that we could break the ice, let's say, and also show them that it is possible to do that, that if they are going to finance cover part of expenses, we could play the role in the kind of public or private-public partnership. And at the same time, it is an experiment for the simple reason that, as far as I know, Marco, but you could correct me, we're the second or the first or the second region of Italy which has managed to do such an impossible task. Thank you.
So welcome to the club, and I believe that actually some of your representatives also will be physically coming here pretty soon. One point that Luca brought up that has not been discussed, and then we can open to more questions if a few questions are coming in, is how, give us some examples in your years of activities. What is an effective way to work as an antenna, so to send back results or trends or the future, as Luca was saying, in a way that is effective and actionable back to your constituencies in UK, in Japan, in Switzerland, or in Italy? Do you have any of you any suggestions based on your past experience on how to be effective about that as an antenna?
I mean, I can take that. I mean, I can give an example of a very important initiative that we've been running for a few years called Silicon Valley Comes to the UK. So it's a very kind of practical way of kind of feeding back and actually bringing the founders from Silicon Valley to both London, Oxford, Cambridge, and more kind of other cities around the UK in a series of events and kind of programs that we run through the year. We have an annual summit coming up this November, so we'll be we're in the process of sort of kind of confirming speakers, but we have some incredible founders who essentially each year have been coming to London and those other cities to really kind of share their stories, their learnings, their insights to inspire young entrepreneurs and the kind of the community, the technology community, kind of more broadly. And it's been very impactful, actually. We run a Scaleup initiative as well, which is a sort of a CEO summit where we select some of the kind of the leading scale-ups in London, and then we have those founders actually kind of be in London to mentor them and kind of, so it's quite kind of hands-on, but that from a feedback perspective is very important in terms of, you know, learning from Silicon Valley and sort of, again, sort of instilling that best practice and that kind of secret sauce into the broader community as well. I mean, apart from that, it's very much kind of hands-on, you know, as part of our sort of results of the last year or so. We did a lot of assessment here, looking at kind of trends, funding, what were those emerging sectors that were really going to make it through the pandemic, and that looking very closely at an alignment of the strengths of the London sectors as well. So things like, you know, fintech and health tech and urban sort of smart mobility, etc. So kind of eyes and ears on the ground, feeding back in, but then also running programs like Silicon Valley Comes to the UK, and actually physically, some virtual, because some will be beaming in virtually for our annual summit in November, but kind of, so it's a kind of a combination.
Right, very mutual. It's actually a question here from Jerome of a Quebec organization. Is more about the ability to attract, as you were saying, but also retain local talent. I don't know, this is an issue across the board in Silicon Valley in particular, is asking if you have any specific insights that you might share really for retention of the best talent that we come across.
You mean within the
organization, the government, the trade organization?
Oh, yes. I mean, this is, again, totally, this is, you know, one of the most important challenges, and but also opportunities that government organizations have. I mean, this idea that technology is now at the epicenter of everything that the government is talking about when it comes to, you know, recovery plans and or policy making or investments and talent, does bring the opportunity for government organization to actually bring in professionals that, you know, would have never worked for government before. And probably I am one of the examples. And the reason why this is real is actually that governments can play a role in economic development using technologies. And so I think this is really one aspect. How to retain them. Personally, I think it's about KPIs and it's about impact, because at the end of the day, you only create a good, let's say, working environment, even within government, if you are actually bringing results, you are able to track records, and you build the culture in the government organization that is aimed at execution.
So you feel that you're actually making an impact.
Yes, and you can drive the change, and you can making an impact. And this is the actual challenge on the government side. Regions actually are the tier, you know, part of the panel. Like regional representative are a core part of this, by the way.
Yeah, yeah. Any more inputs there?
I would like to add, yes. I think the challenge we have as organizations from abroad working on behalf of another government is to create any honestly sense of purpose for an American that honestly couldn't care more about Switzerland. Truth. And I've been told that by people in my staff that really say, you know, honestly, like, I don't really care about Switzerland, right? But we're working on behalf of our governments, and that's ultimately what we're doing on a daily basis. So I think you have to work very carefully with creating an environment where they can find purpose and build purpose for themselves. If you want to have people that are purely local, right? Like, I think the best thing is to find people who are locals, understand the local ecosystem, but somehow have kind of an emotional tie to your home country. And I think you have a lot of Italians here as well. And I think that creates a sense of meaning, right? That it goes beyond just KPIs, et cetera. So I think that's a key thing. But I think if you want pure Americans and want to retain them, you need to give them a large degree of flexibility and create room to create so that they can sort of build their own purpose within the organization and find meaning in that goes beyond the association to a government. So that's something we've definitely always tried to balance at Swissnex, because it's for us very important to have a high degree of locals, because we don't just want to be preaching to the choir, Swiss people to Swiss people.
Yeah, very well put. There's another question on the practicality of hosting trade organizations in the rest of 2021 or Q1 or Q2, more specific. Any of you actually have that in your planning? I know everybody, go figure. Anybody has plans on trade organization in the next 3 quarters?
We don't have any delegation from Japan to here, but we will plan to have a Japan startup pavilion, a Japan pavilion at the CES in 2022. But biggest problem is, Japanese traveler, if they come back to Japan, they have to be isolated, quarantine for 2 weeks. Which makes Japanese business person more difficult, right?
Yeah.
To go back to work. So we have been reviewing what kind of risk we have, and we will decide as soon as possible.
Yeah, because let's take to Q1, as you were mentioning, between CES and the JP Morgan. So there are a number of very, very busy historically conferences that typically are very international by nature.
We're transitioning currently for North America. We'll be bringing 2 missions in the spring, one a creative one, and then to the Valley. We've been working on a program under the banner of Silicon Valley Comes to UK to support female founders. So we're running a program to help female founders actually access funding. So it's sort of an educational program which will culminate in a physical visit to Silicon Valley and to connect them into the ecosystem, to investors, to some stakeholders, etc. In the spring. So beyond horizons. Yeah.
It is 10 o'clock, so I think time is up. We need to get along with our life. Thanks for all the participants there. In particular, thanks for our panelists. We really appreciate your insights. I'm looking forward to working together more. All right. Thank you. Bye, everybody.